So this video is about my experiences and encounters with family members, some more recent, some in the ancestor category. So both sides of my family have been in New England since the 1600s. My mother's side came over in 1640, landed in Salem, Mass. My father's side came over, we believe, based on all the discussions I remember growing up about doing the family tree and all that. I believe the first ancestor arrived 1638 in New Haven. Anyway, my mother's side came over. They landed in Salem, Mass, set up shop. I believe they were merchants. And within a couple generations, started marrying, other families in the area. I more recently discovered about 10 years ago that the third generation to be in Salem, which I believe was my eighth or ninth great-grandfather, married a local woman, Elizabeth Town, who was the daughter of one of the accused in the Salem witch trials. Sarah Clays or Cloys, there's different spellings in the name, but she was one of the accused in the witch trials. Her two sisters were hung. And December of that year, I think 1693, she was in jail. She was accused and thrown in jail. Right about the time when I think the royal governor put a stop to the madness and said, enough of this stops right now. So she, as I read, was broken out of jail. And I also read that she turned around and sued the colony of Massachusetts for damages and won. So after that calamity, they, like a lot of families, actually moved out of Salem and left Salem to get rid of those bad memories. So my family moved down and helped settle the city of Framingham, Mass. So they were there, various branches in the area spread out. But my line ended up moving up to New Hampshire, Western New Hampshire, the same town I've talked about in other videos, Western New Hampshire. And they settled that town. So my great-great-grandfather, Moses, built a homestead and a farm on top of the hill in town and built an 8-bedroom colonial farmhouse with an L on the back. So that became the family homestead. As it was referred to, it was the family farm in the dialect, in the accent. So anyway, my great uncle's son had the farm when we would visit. We would drive up from Connecticut every Memorial Day weekend and visit the family in New Hampshire. So we would visit the farmhouse, and every time we visited, I think it would be a second cousin, once removed. Every time we went in there, he would tell tales about how the house was haunted. And they swore it was haunted by my great-great-grandfather, Moses. So, every place my brother and I would stand in this house, he would point to and say, and they're right there where they're standing, the clock would go crazy. A bowl disappeared at the table next to where they're standing. And we'd go to the stairs. There were footsteps up the stairs a bunch of times, and I'd check, and there was no one up there. So we became very afraid of this house and did not want to visit this house every time we went up to visit New Hampshire. So, that being said, that's what we grew up with. We knew that place was haunted. And apparently by my great-great-grandfather Moses, but we didn't know why. So my mother, at one point, actually went to a medium and was told, Moses is upset. Moses is upset because Charlie didn't get the farm. And Charlie was my grandfather. And my mother did know that, they were, she was born and raised, grew up on that farm at a young age, and her younger sister, my aunt. My grandmother died in childbirth right at the start of the Depression. And so it was my grandfather left to raise my mother and my aunt there on the farm. But they were apparently removed from the farm. They were kicked off the farm by his younger brothers. And so it was the youngest brother who inherited the farm, and then his son got the farm, which is the relative we visited, who had the house when we would visit. So anyway, didn't know much about it till my mother went to the medium. Discovered the apparently great-great-grandfather Moses was pissed off that my grandfather didn't inherit the farm like he was supposed to. Also said that there was something in the attic in a trunk that was ours and we had to go back and get it. So of course that never really happened. So all we knew growing up is that this farm was haunted. My mother did come up for a visit when I was back in Connecticut, and we went up and we met one of her cousins, who was the daughter of the younger brother, the second youngest brother, who instigated, apparently, as we were told, after my great-grandfather died, they convinced my great-grandmother to leave the farm to the youngest brother instead of my grandfather. So that came out of the woodwork. So, of course, she apologized to my mother because they grew up. She knew it. My mother never knew it. So she finally decided it was time to spill the family beans. So anyway, so we found that out. Anyway, it became apparent that, yeah, Moses was probably ticked off because my grandfather was supposed to inherit the farm. So fast forward to 1999. I'm in New Jersey. My cousin in Florida, who I mentioned before, had never been to New Hampshire, never met the relatives, but he was going to a convention in Boston. So he said, I'm going to be in Boston. I'd love to get up to New Hampshire. Can you tell me how to get there? I said, I will drive up and get you and bring you up there. So we had one of my grandmother's sisters, her youngest sister, was still alive, my great aunt. And so I said, well, go visit them and I'll show you the farm, show you the town. So I drive up to Boston, get them. We visit with my great aunt, spend a few hours with her. Then I drive us over to the farm on top of the hill. And we pull up and the house is very decrepit at this point. It's falling apart. It's obvious that the relative that we would visit had passed, or I think he was in hospice care at that point. Anyway, so the house was abandoned. The house was not occupied. And there was a very crude plywood sign against a sawhorse on the front grass that was unmowed that said, for sale, with a telephone number. So I said, well, he wanted to go in and see the house, my cousin. I said, I don't know if that's a good idea. Let's check with the relatives. I knew cousins lived next door. So went over there, knocked on the door. No one's home, of course. So we come back. He says, well, I really want to see that house. I said, well, I'm not going in there because it's haunted. So he says, oh, come on. So he wanders onto the porch. And of course, one of the panes of glass is broken by the doorknob. So he reaches in, unlocks the door, and lets himself in. So I hesitantly go in behind him. And of course, the house is falling apart. It did look like a haunted house at this point. It was just holes in the floor. It was a mess. So we get into the house. I instantly yell out, Grandpa Moses, it's Charlie's grandsons. We're just here to see the house. Please don't, throw things at us or force us out of the house. And within a few seconds of me saying that, this warm feeling just came right over me, went through my whole body. It's like someone threw a warm blanket over me. It wasn't the light feeling that I got, that I talked about in the other video, but this warm feeling of comfort, love, and it felt like we'd just come home, like we were back home in the house. So I mentioned this, and my cousin says, yeah, I just felt the same thing. So we walk all over the house, did manage to go up to the attic carefully, and of course there's no trunk, there's nothing to look in, there's nothing hidden, we couldn't find anything in the house. It had been mostly cleaned out at this point. So we wandered around, saw the house, took some pictures, and then got out. And then for weeks afterwards, all we could do was email back and forth about how great it was to see the house and we should have bought it. Found out it sold for a very reasonable price after that, but it's since been torn down and the land was divided each side of the road, and cousins have bought those plots. So it's still technically in the family, so that's good. But anyway, I'm guessing that was my great-grandfather Moses coming to say hello and thank you and welcome us into the space. So that was a nice, poignant ending to that otherwise scary story growing up. More recently, talk about my grandmother, my father's mother. I was actually born and raised in New York in Westchester County, and we grew up in a mid-rise apartment building, 5th floor up. And in 1975, my grandfather passed. My grandmother had passed when I was just about to turn 1. My mother told me later on, a few years ago, that she was actually, my grandmother was the mother hen of the family, and she was planning this huge bash of a first birthday party for me when she passed, right before, a few months before. So that's always kind of sat with me. So anyway, my father inherited the house, and so in 1976, when I was 10, we packed up and moved over to the house in Connecticut. So we move in. My father's sister, my aunt, and her family were next door. My grandfather built them a house as a wedding gift, so they were next door. So it was all in the family. But moving in the house, and my grandmother played the piano. She played the organ. She was very musical. She volunteered to play at churches and other events. And so her upright piano is still in the living room because it's too heavy to move and it's too heavy to take out of the house. So, of course, my mother says, you need to take piano lessons. You're going to play Grandma's piano. Great. So, wasn't real thrilled about that, but, I'm basically forced to take piano lessons. And, of course, any child never wants to practice. It's like, practice, you need to practice, you need to practice. So I'm forced to practice one evening, and I'm sitting there playing the piano. It's right before dinner. And as I'm playing, I feel this hand behind me, and then I feel someone standing behind me. And of course, it should have assumed it was my grandmother, but no, I thought it was my great aunt, her younger sister. My great aunt lived about a mile away, and I got to know her very well. She kind of became my surrogate grandmother since my grandmother passed before I turned 1. So she became my surrogate grandmother, and so she had the same exact piano in her living room. Everything that my grandmother had, she had. They had to have the same things, apparently. So I assumed it was my great aunt standing behind me. And of course, over time, come to realize, it's her piano, it's her house. It had to be her. So I go to a medium and I'm looking for confirmation. So I asked the medium, thinking about my grandmother, there's an incident I'm thinking about. I wanted to know if that was her. So the medium starts meditating and she says, it's like, oh yeah, your grandmother was definitely around you. You were like 2 or 3 years old and you were leaning out this window and it was very high up and you were about to fall out and she grabbed you and pulled you back in again. Like, oh. So like I say, we're on the 5th floor of that apartment building and there were no bars or anything and the train tracks were right there. So every time a train went by, I had to look out because my father was a big train fan. So of course I became a train fan. So every time a train went by, we'd have to look out the window. So apparently I was leaning out that window and she pulled me back in and saved my life. Thank you, Grandma. So it wasn't the piano incident, but still that was a good one to find out. Of course, I don't think my parents ever knew about this. They never mentioned it. But so yes, apparently I've had 2 encounters with my grandmother after she passed. So like I said, next video I will talk about more recent encounters with other family members.